To the thousands of followers who watch my daughter-in-law's social media account, their life is a perfect, unblemished paradise of cream, beige, and quiet luxury. Chloe is a modern American aesthetic influencer. Every square inch of her world is curated, from the minimalist organic linen couch to the color-coordinated organic pantry jars. There are no loud noises, no bright colors, and absolutely no clutter. But to achieve that cold, spotless perfection, my son Julian had to bleach away the very soil he grew up on for 30 years. I was a farmhouse mother in upstate New York. My hands were always stained with rich garden dirt, flour from the morning biscuits, and sweet blackberry jam. When my husband passed away, leaving us with nothing but a failing apple orchard, I didn't let the bank take my son's future. I worked 2 jobs, running the local diner by day and patching tractor tires by night. And when Julian got accepted into NYU, I quietly signed the papers to sell our family's historic farmhouse. I gave up my home, my memories, and my land, just to wire him the $90,000 down payment for his first Manhattan apartment. I moved into a small, rented cottage, perfectly content, because I believed I was building a foundation for my son's happiness. But somewhere between his first $1 million Wall Street bonus and his marriage to Chloe Sterling, Julian stopped looking at my sacrifices as a blessing. He started looking at my countryside warmth as a dirty smudge on his brand new, pristine lifestyle. The true boundary of their new corporate reality was drawn last week when they finally completed their $3 million modern farmhouse mansion in the Hamptons. Tonight was their grand housewarming dinner, an exclusive event for Chloe's wealthy country club circle and Julian's primary hedge fund investors. I arrived the night before, carrying a heavy, warm ceramic dish of my traditional, homemade chicken pot pie and a fresh blackberry cobbler. The exact meal Julian used to beg for when he was a boy. But the moment I stepped through the massive, oak double doors, the warmth left the room. Chloe didn't hug me. She looked down at my colourful, hand-knitted floral cardigan and my worn leather boots with a look of pure, calculated anxiety. "Oh, Eleanor, you brought food," Chloe said, her voice dripping with that passive-aggressive, high society sweetness. She didn't even touch the dish. She signalled her assistant to take it directly to the kitchen. "We are doing a strictly organic, gluten-free, aesthetic catering tonight. The colour of the crust doesn't really match the tablescape, and the smell of heavy butter, it's just a bit too overwhelming for the open-concept living room." An hour later, before the guests arrived, Julian walked into my room, avoiding my eyes, nervously jingling his car keys. "Mum, I need to ask you a huge favour," Julian muttered, his voice dropping into a strained, low whisper. "Chloe's interior design team is doing a live stream house tour tonight, and, well, your luggage and your outfits, they don't really fit the minimalist vibe of the main guest wing. We've set up the detached garden she shed in the backyard for you. It's got a beautiful view, and it's completely separate from the main house. It's just for tonight, so Chloe's investor friends can focus on the architectural layout. Please, don't make this difficult for us." I stood by the window, looking out into the dark, freezing backyard at the small, unheated wooden shed. My son, the boy who used to hide in my arms during thunderstorms, was asking his mother to sleep in the garden storage, so that his wife's social media feed wouldn't look cluttered. "I understand, Julian," I said softly, my voice steady and entirely devoid of emotion. "I will move my things immediately." As I carried my old suitcase out into the cold evening air, I saw Chloe standing by the luxury marble island, watching a catering staff member slide my father's traditional chicken pot pie directly into the large, stainless steel trash can, replacing it with small, beige plates of cold cucumber appetizers. They wanted a world completely stripped of color, completely stripped of history. They were about to learn that when you bleach the foundation, the entire house collapses. The heavy, melodic chime of the front doorbell echoed through the multi-million-dollar mansion at exactly 6 o'clock. Chloe's face instantly transformed. The cold, vicious snort she had just directed at me vanished, replaced by a radiant, high society smile as she practically floated toward the grand foyer. Richard and Beatrice Sterling stepped into the warmth of the house. They were the undisputed royalty of Connecticut real estate developers, draped in pristine camel hair coats and smelling of expensive, old money private clubs. They didn't just walk into a room, they inspected it, looking at the minimalist design, the crystal chandeliers, and the high-end catering staff with the eyes of buyers checking an investment. "Oh, darling, the house looks absolutely immaculate," Beatrice Sterling purred, kissing Chloe on both cheeks while a hired butler took her fur coat. "And Julian, congratulations on the hedge fund partnership. Richard has been telling the board members all week that you are the sharpest legal mind we've brought into the family circle." Julian beamed, his chest puffing out with an intense, desperate need for validation. He shook Richard Sterling's hand with absolute, submissive respect, laughing at a joke about interest rates that he didn't even find funny. He was completely intoxicating by the aroma of wealth and power. Then, Beatrice's eyes drifted past Julian's tailored shoulder and landed directly on me. I was still standing near the kitchen entrance, wearing my simple navy blue Sunday dress and holding my faded cloth purse. In a room full of silk, diamonds, and tailored tuxedos, I looked like a ghost from a completely different world. "Oh," Beatrice murmured, her voice dropping an octave, her smile freezing into a tight, polite mask. "Chloe, sweetie, I didn't realize you had hired additional domestic help for the holiday. I thought you said the Michelin star catering company was handling everything." Chloe didn't even flinch. She let out a sharp, high-pitched, theatrical laugh that made my stomach turn. "Oh, Mother, don't be silly," Chloe whispered, her voice dripping with passive-aggressive venom. "This isn't the staff. This is Julian's mother, Eleanor. She unexpectedly took a cross-country bus from Ohio to surprise us. We tried to tell her the travel would be too stressful, but, well, you know how traditional small-town people can be." Richard Sterling gave me a brief, indifferent nod, the kind of look a billionaire gives a passing waiter, before turning his back completely to discuss a new $100 million commercial land acquisition in downtown Greenwich. I was officially invisible. I was an administrative error in their perfect suburban evening. 10 minutes later, as the catering staff began arranging the organic, gold leaf appetizers in the main dining room, Chloe grabbed my arm. Her grip wasn't gentle. Her long, manicured nails dug straight through the fabric of my dress as she pulled me away from the guests, leading me down the back service hallway toward a heavy, white door. "Eleanor, we need to have a very serious, adult conversation about logistics," Chloe hissed, her voice dropping into a dangerous, venomous whisper. "The professional photographer is arriving in 5 minutes to take the official family portraits for my social media partners and the Greenwich Luxury magazine. Your current aesthetic does not align with the brand alignment of this household." I looked at my daughter-in-law, my heart aching with a profound, crushing weight. "Chloe, I am Julian's mother. I just want to sit with my son on Thanksgiving." "And you will eat, Eleanor, but not here," Chloe snapped, throwing the white door open, revealing the steep, dark concrete stairs leading down into the unfinished basement. We had a seating calculation error. The main dining table is strictly reserved for the primary investors of the Sterling Land Trust. But don't worry, I set up a beautiful, quiet, private space just for you downstairs. It's much more your speed. Julian walked down the hallway, holding a crystal glass of scotch. He saw me standing at the edge of the basement stairs, and for a single, fleeting second, a look of deep guilt crossed his face. But then, he looked at Chloe's cold, unyielding expression, and his spine completely collapsed. "Mum, please, just don't make a scene tonight," Julian muttered, refusing to look me in the eye, his voice sharp and irritated. "Chloe spent 3 months coordinating this dinner. It's a high-stakes networking event. If my hedge fund partners see you sitting there in a $10 thrift store sweater, talking about your small-town public library, it ruins the entire old money pedigree we've built. Just go down to the basement table for a few hours. Do it for my career. Don't ruin this for me." I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I looked at the boy I had sacrificed my entire youth to raise. The boy whose Harvard tuition I paid for by skipping meals for 8 straight winters, and I realized he was completely gone. I turned around and walked down the cold, damp concrete steps into the dark basement. When I reached the bottom, the heavy wooden door above me slammed shut, the lock clicking into place with absolute, unyielding finality. Beneath the harsh, flickering light of a single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, sat a tiny, plastic, green kids' table. On it was a single paper plate, a plastic fork, and a paper cup of tap water. They had banished me to the dark, so their gilded lie could shine in the ballroom above. They thought they had successfully locked the embarrassing working-class mother away from their multi-million-dollar empire. They had completely forgotten paragraph 1 of the Connecticut property ledger. They were about to learn who actually owned the ground beneath their castle. Above my head, the ceiling creaked with the rhythmic, heavy thud of $100 designer heels and polished leather Oxfords. The muffled sounds of a classical string quartet, the clinking of crystal champagne flutes, and the booming, arrogant laughter of Manhattan's elite real estate tycoons echoed down the basement steps. Up there, in the warmth of the roaring fireplace, my son was cementing his future. Up there, he was a king. Down here, in the damp, cold shadows. I sat perfectly straight on a tiny, green plastic kids' chair. My knees practically touched my chest, and the harsh, unfiltered light of the single hanging bulb cast long, distorted shadows against the grey concrete walls. On the paper plate before me sat a cold, dry slice of catered organic turkey and a spoonful of flavourless, unsalted quinoa. It was a meal designed by a nutritionist, completely stripped of soul, stripped of love. I looked down at my wrinkled hands that still bore the microscopic scars of 1,000 needle pricks from my decades of restoring historical documents. I remembered the winter nights in Ohio, when the radiator clanked and leaked, and I would wrap Julian in 3 layers of thrift store blankets, blowing on his cold fingers so he could keep writing his legal essays. I had traded my health, my youth, and my comfort so that he could one day stand in a room with a crystal chandelier. I didn't cry. The working class doesn't cry when the wind blows cold. We just tighten our coats. I reached into my old cloth purse, pulling out a small, worn, leather-bound notebook. It was my grandfather's original estate ledger, its pages yellowed and fragile, dating back to 1920. I ran my fingers over the faded ink, finding comfort in the absolute, unyielding permanence of historical records. People lie, children forget, but the land always remembers the bloodline that paid for it. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs clicked open. A harsh, brilliant beam of artificial light cut through the basement darkness, followed by the click-clack of Chloe's designer stilettos descending the concrete steps. But she wasn't alone. She was holding a high-end smartphone mounted on a sleek, pink stabilizing gimbal, a bright, circular ring light attached to the rig, illuminating the dark basement with a blinding, clinical glare. She was live streaming directly to her 2 million social media followers. "Hey, my beautiful organic family." Chloe chimed into the camera, her voice pitched into that sugary, hyper-enthusiastic influencer cadence that made my skin crawl. "We are right in the middle of our elite Greenwich Thanksgiving gala, but I wanted to step away to show you guys something truly, deeply wholesome. You all know how much I value family inclusivity, right?" She turned the camera rig, snapping the blinding ring light directly into my face. I blinked, shielding my eyes with my old leather notebook as she stepped closer, her expensive French perfume fighting against the smell of damp concrete. "Look at this. You guys," Chloe cooed, zooming the lens into my paper plate and the tiny plastic green table. "This is Julian's sweet, eccentric mother, Eleanor. She travelled all the way from a tiny, rustic town in Ohio. We set up this gorgeous, minimalist, old-fashioned private dining oasis for her downstairs because she told us she gets completely overwhelmed by high society crowds. Isn't that just so precious? She's staying true to her humble, working-class roots, even on Thanksgiving." The chat on her screen exploded with thousands of scrolling hearts and messages praising Chloe for being so thoughtful, humble, and inclusive. Chloe leaned down, her face inches from mine, her eyes completely dead, cold and calculating, completely detached from the bright smile she was forcing for her audience. She reached out and patted my shoulder, her long, sharp acrylic nails pressing into my skin like claws. "Say hi to the stream, Eleanor," Chloe whispered, her voice dripping with a terrifying, passive-aggressive venom that the microphone couldn't catch. "Show them how grateful you are for our hospitality. Don't ruin my engagement metrics." I looked directly into the camera lens, then looked at Chloe. "Chloe," I said, my voice calm, steady, and carrying the resonant weight of a schoolteacher who had commanded classrooms for 40 years. A gilded house built on a lie can never withstand a winter storm. You should be very careful what you display to the world. Chloe's smile twitched for a microsecond. She quickly spun the camera back to her face, her eyes flashing with a sudden, vicious rage. "Oh, bless her heart. You guys." Chloe laughed nervously into the phone, marching back up the stairs. The elderly can get so confused after a long bus ride. Make sure to hit that subscribe button for more exclusive family lifestyle content. Bye. The basement door slammed shut, and the lock clicked into place once more. The silence returned, heavy, suffocating, and final. They thought they had turned my humiliation into a marketing tool. They thought they had successfully buried the working-class mother in the dark, while they drank champagne on the upper floors. They had no idea that the small leather notebook in my purse contained the legal survey maps of the entire Greenwich residential valley. They didn't know that the foundation they were dancing on was built on a ground that I legally controlled. The basement was damp, and the silence that followed Chloe's grand exit was heavier than the concrete walls around me. I sat under the flickering bulb, staring at the paper cup of tap water on the tiny green plastic table. From upstairs, a sudden burst of collective laughter erupted, followed by the distinct clinking of crystal glasses. Julian was probably making his toast, basking in the artificial light of a world he didn't belong to. I slowly pulled out my phone, an old, scratched flip phone that Julian had begged me to replace because he thought it looked impoverished. I opened my grandfather's yellowed leather ledger, looking at the ironclad registration numbers of the Claiborne Heritage Trust, the multi-billion-dollar historical land foundation that had quietly owned the deeds to half of Greenwich, Connecticut, since 1920. I dialed a private, unlisted 10-digit number. It didn't ring twice. Eleanor, a deep, impeccably refined voice answered, carrying the immediate alertness of a high-stakes corporate fixer. It was Thomas Blackwell, the chief executive trustee of our family trust. "Happy Thanksgiving. We've been waiting for your clearance regarding the downtown commercial rollover. Is everything settled with your son?" Julian made his choice. "Thomas," I said softly, my voice perfectly steady, echoing slightly in the empty concrete basement. He and his new family believe that foundations don't matter. They believe that money buys the right to treat human beings like garbage. It's time to show them the math. There was a long, pregnant pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the rustle of high-end legal parchment over the secure line. "What are your orders, Eleanor?" Thomas asked, his tone dropping into a freezing, absolute legal precision. "Execute the immediate, non-curable termination clause on the Greenwich master lease," I whispered, looking up at the creaking wooden beams of the ceiling. "And, Thomas, check the underlying land deed for the residential property at 42 Laurel Crest Lane, the home Julian just purchased." "I don't need to check, Eleanor. I drafted that deed myself," Thomas replied coldly. "The entire estate sits on Claiborne Trust land. Julian's mortgage is contingent on a master lease agreement that requires absolute compliance with the Trust's ancestral code of conduct. If you revoke the master lease, his ownership vanishes. They are technically trespassing on your soil." Revoke it, I said, closing my old ledger with a soft, definitive thud. Bring the storm, Thomas. The phone call ended, and for exactly 3 minutes, nothing happened. The basement remained dark, and the classical music upstairs continued to hum. But then, the music stopped completely, cut short by a harsh, scraping sound, like a needle being violently dragged across a vinyl record. The heavy, rhythmic footsteps that had been pacing the dining room floor suddenly turned frantic. I heard a loud, muffled shout from Richard Sterling, Chloe's billionaire developer father. His booming, confident voice was suddenly pitched with an intense, raw panic. Thud, the thud, the thud. The heavy white basement door at the top of the stairs violently unlatched. It didn't open gracefully. It was thrown open with such force that it slammed against the dry wall. Julian's frantic, rapid footsteps rattled the concrete steps as he sprinted down into the darkness, his $5,000 tuxedo jacket completely unbuttoned, his silk tie crooked, his face entirely drained of colour. Behind him, Chloe was stumbling down the stairs, her smartphone gimbal forgotten, her perfect silk dress catching on the rough wooden railing, her eyes wide with a sudden, paralysing terror. "Mum!" Julian roared, his voice cracking as he reached the bottom of the steps, his hands shaking violently as he held up his glowing tablet screen. "Mum, what did you do? What did your little historical book club do?" I didn't stand up from my tiny plastic chair. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked up at my son, my expression completely unyielding. I didn't do anything. "Julian," I said calmly, crossing my hands over my lap. "I am just an uncultured, small-town schoolteacher sitting at the kids' table, where you put me. Don't play games with me, Mum!" Julian screamed, stepping toward me, his voice trembling with a desperate, defensive rage. Richard's entire $100 million downtown commercial merger just received an emergency, automated federal injunction. The Master Land Trust just revoked our commercial access rights, citing a material breach of the ancestral estate code. And my mortgage company just sent a high-priority, automated legal notice to my phone. He dropped to his knees, his expensive leather shoes scraping against the cold concrete floor, right next to my paper plate of dry turkey. He held the screen inches from my face, his eyes bloodshot with sudden, ruinous realization. "It says our house, this mansion, is under immediate foreclosure because the underlying land trust has terminated our residential lease." Julian whimpered, his voice dropping into a desperate, terrified sob. "Mum, the name on the federal injunction isn't a bank. It's the Claiborne Heritage Trust. Your maiden name is Claiborne. Mum, please, look at me. Who actually owns this house?" I slowly pushed back the tiny, green plastic kids' chair, the cheap legs scraping softly against the damp concrete floor. I stood up, smoothing down the front of my ironed, $10 navy blue Sunday dress. I didn't look at Julian, who was still on his knees in his custom tuxedo, staring at his tablet as if his entire life were dissolving into the screen. I didn't look at Chloe, whose breath was coming in short, ragged, un-influencer-like gasps. I walked past them, my worn winter boots stepping right over the dry slice of catered turkey, and began my slow, deliberate climb up the basement stairs. With every step I took, the muffled, chaotic noise of the upper floor grew louder, Julian and Chloe followed me like terrified, silent children, their previous arrogance completely stripped away, replaced by a raw, suffocating panic. I pushed open the heavy white door, stepping back into the brilliant, warm light of the grand foyer. The classical string quartet had packed up their instruments, standing awkwardly in the corner, while the high society catering staff stood frozen with silver trays in their hands. The entire living room was a scene of absolute corporate devastation. Richard Sterling was pacing the length of the minimalist marble fireplace, his expensive camel hair coat thrown onto the floor, his face purple with rage as he screamed into his encrypted smartphone. Beatrice Sterling was sitting on the cream-coloured silk couch, her diamond-ringed hands trembling so violently she couldn't even lift her crystal glass of champagne. "I don't care what the system says," Richard roared into the phone, his voice cracking with a terrifying, old money desperation. "You tell the Federal Compliance Board that the Sterling Land Trust has spent 5 years underwriting this $100 million downtown merger. They can't just freeze our assets on Thanksgiving. Who signed the emergency injunction? Give me a name." He listened for a fraction of a second, and then his phone literally slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the expensive hardwood floor. His eyes went wide, completely blank, with an intense, paralyzing shock. Richard slowly turned around, his gaze moving away from his fallen phone, past his trembling wife, past his sobbing daughter, and locking directly onto me. He didn't see an impoverished, uncultured mother from Ohio anymore. He saw a ghost, a legal titan that his entire corporate empire had been trying to court for over a decade. Eleanor," Richard stammered, his booming billionaire confidence completely evaporating into thin air. He took 3 unstable steps forward, his hands extended in a desperate, trembling gesture of respect. "Eleanor, Claiborne, my God, it's you. You are the absolute sole trustee of the Claiborne Heritage Trust." Chloe stopped dead in her tracks, her mouth opening in a silent, horrified gasp. She looked at her billionaire father, then looked at me, her mind completely unable to process the total, catastrophic shift in the room's power dynamic. "Dad, what are you talking about?" Chloe whispered, her voice trembling as she reached for her father's arm. "That's just Julian's mother. She's a retired public library worker. She lives in a trailer town. She brought lard stuffing to our mansion." "Shut up, Chloe!" Richard screamed, violently swinging his arm to shake her off, his eyes never leaving my calm, resolute face. "You stupid, arrogant girl, shut your mouth. The Claiborne Trust doesn't just own the ground this house sits on. They own the entire commercial district of downtown Greenwich, my entire development company, our entire family net worth is completely contingent on the master lease agreements controlled by this woman's family." Julian stood behind his wife, his face completely white, looking like a man who had just realized he had built his entire career on a frozen lake, and the ice had just shattered. "Mom," Julian choked out, his voice dropping into a high-pitched, childlike whimper. You always told me Grandpa left us nothing but an old book business. You let me pay for Harvard with library money." "I let you see what you valued, Julian," I said, my voice completely calm, slicing through the luxurious, suffocating room like a scalpel. I wanted to see if my son would remember the foundation that raised him, or if he would sell his soul for a cream-coloured silk dress and a curated lie on Instagram. I walked over to the grand mahogany dining table, looking at the gold leaf plates and the Michelin star catering. I didn't look back. "Richard," I said softly, addressing the billionaire developer without a single ounce of fear. "Your family has 30 minutes to vacate this property. The master residential lease for 42 Laurel Crest Lane is officially terminated." The word, vacate, hung in the luxurious air of the grand dining room, heavy, toxic, and absolute. For 30 seconds, nobody breathed. The only sound in the multi-million-dollar mansion was the crackle of the designer fireplace, burning through expensive, organic logs that suddenly felt like burning money. Richard Sterling didn't hesitate. He didn't try to defend his daughter, and he didn't try to comfort Julian. He dropped his expensive leather briefcase, sprinted across the polished hardwood floor, and practically threw himself at my feet, his hands open in a desperate, existential panic. "Eleanor, please, I implore you," Richard choked out, his face turning a deep, terrifying purple. "The downtown commercial expansion, the one your trust just frozen, it represents 80% of my company's liquid capital. If that injunction holds past midnight, the banks will call in my corporate loans. My entire life's work completely wiped out because of a stupid, domestic misunderstanding." "This isn't a misunderstanding, Richard," I said softly, my voice remaining perfectly calm, colder than the November rain outside. "Your daughter understood exactly what she was doing when she threw my late husband's heritage stuffing into the garbage disposal. Your son understood exactly what he was doing when he locked his own mother in a dark basement to protect his old money pedigree. They built their palace on my soil and then treated me like dirt. Now, the ground is shifting." Chloe watched her billionaire father groveling, her mind completely breaking under the weight of the reality shift. She grabbed Julian's arm, shaking him violently. Her voice pitched in a high, piercing shriek. "Julian, do something. Call your legal partners. This is our house. We signed the mortgage. She can't just kick us out on Thanksgiving. It's illegal." Julian didn't move. He looked like a puppet whose strings had been violently cut. He was a master of corporate litigation, a ruthless courtroom predator, but he knew the law. He knew that a master land lease termination with no curable clause from the Claiborne Trust was an unwinnable death sentence. By 45 minutes past the hour, the grand holiday gala had turned into a desperate, chaotic survival evacuation. The 5-star Michelin catering staff, realizing they wouldn't be paid by a foreclosed estate, began packing up their silver trays and leaving through the back door, taking the gold leaf appetizers with them. Chloe was frantic. Her eyes were completely bloodshot as she stared at her smartphone. The live stream she had so proudly broadcasted 10 minutes ago was now a weapon of mass destruction. Her followers, having witnessed her father's public breakdown and the terrifying revelation of her fake lifestyle, were turning on her in real time. The comments section was scrolling with absolute, brutal mockery. Her major corporate sponsors, including the luxury lifestyle brands that paid for her Greenwich lifestyle, were sending automated termination emails to her inbox. Her digital empire was dissolving in her hands. "Julian, please, tell her you're sorry." Chloe screamed, tears streaming down her face, completely ruining her expensive, high society makeup. She fell to her knees next to her father, looking up at me with a desperate, theatrical repentance. "Eleanor, Mom, please, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know you were a Claiborne. If I knew, I would have given you the VIP seat at the head of the table. I would have saved the pie." "And that, Chloe, is exactly why you don't deserve to stand on this ground," I whispered, looking down at her with a profound, quiet pity. "You only respect the coat. You never respect the human being inside it." Julian finally moved. He crawled across the hardwood floor, his $5,000 tuxedo dragging through the dust, reaching out to touch the hem of my Sunday dress. "Mom, please," Julian sobbed, his voice cracking into a raw, agonizing whimper. "I am your son, your little boy. You can't do this to me. I worked so hard to get out of that basement apartment. I did all of this to make you proud." "No, Julian, you did this for them," I said, gently stepping backward, pulling my dress out of his trembling grip. "You were so ashamed of the dust on my hands that you forgot those were the very hands that lifted you out of the dark. You wanted to live like a king, Julian. Now, you can find out what it's like to build an empire without my foundation." The private security team from the Claiborne Trust, dressed in identical, silent black suits, walked through the front door. The eviction was no longer a threat. It was a physical reality. The transition from high society luxury to utter, humiliating displacement happened with a terrifying, bureaucratic speed. Within 20 minutes, the front lawn of 4 Laurel Crest Lane, once pristine, manicured, and green, was crowded with official vehicles. The local Greenwich Sheriff's Department, flanked by private compliance SUVs from the Claiborne Trust, stood under the heavy, freezing November rain. The blue and red emergency lights flashed rhythmically, casting long, eerie shadows across the colonial white pillars of the mansion. Julian, Chloe, and her billionaire parents were pushed out onto the grand stone driveway. They didn't even have time to pack bags. Julian stood in the downpour, his $5,000 custom tuxedo soaking wet, his hair plastered to his forehead, looking blankly at a yellow, laminated eviction notice that a sheriff deputy had just taped directly onto his hand-carved oak front door. Next to him, Chloe was wrapped in a cheap, silver emergency foil blanket provided by the deputies, her silk dress stained with mud, her bare feet shivering on the wet asphalt. 2 industrial locksmiths, hired by my family trust, walked past them without a single word. The heavy, mechanical buzz of their power tools echoed through the neighborhood, drilling out the high-end smart locks that Julian had installed just last month, replacing them with heavy, secure, industrial steel deadbolts. The keys to this castle no longer belonged to the golden boy of Manhattan litigation. "Mom, please look at me," Julian screamed over the sound of the rain, rushing toward the sleek, black town car that Thomas Blackwell had parked at the edge of the driveway. He slammed his wet hands against the tinted glass window, his voice cracking into a desperate, unhinged sob. "You can't do this. The partners at the firm, they're calling me. They saw Chloe's live stream. They're asking if I'm under federal investigation. If you don't lift this injunction, I will be disbarred by tomorrow morning. Everything I built, everything I sacrificed for, will be gone. The window slowly rolled down, revealing my calm, unyielding face in the warm, dry interior of the vehicle. "You didn't sacrifice for your career, Julian," I said softly, my voice carrying clearly through the damp night. "You sacrificed me. You sacrificed the truth. You thought that by erasing your history, by treating your mother like an uncultured liability, you could buy your way into their kingdom. But a kingdom built on my soil answers to my law." Richard Sterling stood under a large golf umbrella held by his trembling assistant, his eyes fixed on his smartphone as his corporate empire collapsed in real time. The automated margin calls from Wall Street were hitting his account every 60 seconds. Because the Claiborne Trust had frozen the downtown commercial land deeds, his bank lines of credit were instantly snapped shut. He wasn't a billionaire anymore. He was a man drowning in $100 million of unpayable debt on Thanksgiving night. "It's over, Richard," Beatrice Sterling whispered, her expensive fur coat drenched and heavy with rainwater, her voice hollow, dead, and completely defeated. "The board of directors just called an emergency meeting. They're removing you as CEO. The family trust, everything we used to collateralize the Greenwich project, is completely gone." Chloe dropped to her knees on the wet gravel, her smartphone buzzing violently in her hand. The screen was lighting up with hundreds of text messages from her social media management team, notifying her that her accounts were being permanently flagged for fraudulent branding, and her luxury vehicle leases were being terminated by morning. She looked up at the massive, darkened mansion, the house that was supposed to be the crown jewel of her influencer lifestyle. The lights inside were turned off, one, by the security staff. The golden lie was officially dark. Julian fell down next to his wife, his hands digging into the cold mud of the lawn he had paid millions to own. He looked at the shattered remains of my late husband's traditional ceramic dish, which the catering staff had dumped into the outdoor trash bin during their hasty exit. A few pieces of broken porcelain lay glistening under the flashing police lights. He had traded a mother's 25 years of absolute, unyielding devotion for a group of people who wouldn't even share their umbrella with him when the storm arrived. "Thomas," I said quietly, leaning back into the leather seat of the town car. "Yes, Eleanor." Thomas Blackwell replied, shifting the car into drive. "Close the gates," I whispered, looking out at my son one last time as he sat in the mud, weeping under the cold Connecticut rain. Let them see what it feels like to survive the winter without a foundation. The heavy black iron gates of the estate slowly rolled shut, locking the Vance and Sterling families outside in the dark, while the town car smoothly glided away into the night. 1 week after Thanksgiving, the quiet, comforting smell of ancient paper, organic leather oil, and dried ink returned to my life. I sat beneath the single, familiar brass lamp in my small restoration shop in Ohio. Outside, a gentle, steady snow was beginning to blanket the quiet, working-class streets of the town. My world was small once more, dusty, low profit, and perfectly peaceful. The corporate storm that had devastated Greenwich, Connecticut, didn't touch the windows of my shop, but the headlines in the financial papers told the entire, brutal story. The Sterling Land Trust was officially in receivership. Richard Sterling had been forced to liquidate 80% of his real estate portfolio to pay off the called bank loans, stripping his family of their old money status and leaving them completely broke. Chloe's social media accounts had gone completely dark, her digital presence erased after her luxury sponsors filed multi-million-dollar lawsuits for brand misrepresentation and fraud. And my son, Julian, had suffered the ultimate corporate execution. The senior partners at Sterling and Cross, realizing that Julian had completely alienated the Claiborne Heritage Trust and brought a public relations catastrophe to their doorstep, voted unanimously to terminate his partnership. Without the Sterling family backing, and with a pending federal investigation into his financial disclosures, his law license was suspended. The golden boy of corporate litigation was completely undone. By the third day after the foreclosure, Chloe had already filed for an expedited divorce, taking what little liquid cash remained in their shared accounts and leaving Julian completely alone in a cheap, rented motel room on the outskirts of New Jersey. He had traded his mother's lifetime of devotion for a gilded circle of elite partners, and the moment the gold faded, they had eaten him alive. At exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, the small, brass bell above my shop door chimed. I didn't look up from the fragile, 19th century historical atlas I was carefully repairing. The footsteps that entered the shop were slow, heavy, and completely unstable. There was no confidence in the stride, no sound of polished $3,000 designer Oxfords. Julian stood under the dim light of the entrance. He wasn't wearing a custom Italian tuxedo anymore. He was wearing a cheap, faded nylon jacket that he must have bought from a gas station. His clothes damp from the snow, his hands shaking violently from the biting Ohio cold. His face was hollow, his eyes completely bloodshot and filled with an intense, agonizing desperation. He looked exactly like the 19-year-old boy who used to sit in our freezing basement apartment before the vanity of Manhattan corporate culture poisoned his soul. "Mom," Julian whispered, his voice cracking into a dry, ragged sob as he took a tentative step toward my workbench. "Mom, please. I walked all the way from the bus station. I don't have anywhere else to go, Mom. The banks took everything. Chloe left me, the firm. They destroyed my name. I have nothing left." I slowly placed my brass magnifying glass onto the historical atlas, finally looking up to meet my son's desperate gaze. My expression was completely devoid of anger, carrying only a profound, quiet sorrow. "You had everything, Julian," I said softly, my voice echoing in the silent, dusty shop. "You had a mother who loved you enough to starve so you could read law books. You had a heritage built on honesty, hard work, and a foundation that could withstand any winter storm. But you chose to trade all of it for a curated lie on a smartphone screen." Julian dropped to his knees on the worn wooden floor of my shop, his tears dripping onto the dusty floorboards. He reached out, his trembling hands gripping the edge of my wooden workbench, begging like a criminal awaiting a sentence. "Mom, please, you're a Claiborne. You control the trust. One phone call from you, just one signature, and Thomas Blackwell can restore my partnership. You can buy back the house. Please, Mum, don't leave me in the dark. I'm your son." The Julian who was my son died the moment he locked his mother in a basement to protect his brand. I whispered, my voice perfectly steady. "Absolute, and final. I will not sign the paper, Julian. I will not bail you out of the prison you built with your own hands. You were so ashamed of the working class, so ashamed of the dust on my coat, that you forgot that the dust is what creates the bricks that build the skyscraper. I stood up, walking past him toward the front door. I pulled open the heavy wood door, letting the cold winter wind and the falling snow swirl into the warm shop. It's time to leave. Julian, I said quietly, pointing out toward the dark, snowy street. Go build a life from scratch, without my money and without my foundation. Learn the price of humility. Julian looked up at me, realizing that the maternal anchor he had so casually thrown away was never coming back. He slowly stood up, his head bowed, and walked out of the shop, his figure disappearing into the blinding, white Ohio snowstorm. I closed the heavy oak door, turning the deadbolt with a firm, satisfying click. I walked back to my workbench, sat down under the warm brass lamp, and picked up my needle to restore the history before me. The lies were completely gone, and the truth was finally at peace.